A mysterious woman is found unconscious on the rocky shore, her past swept away by the Tediand. Only one man stands between her and the shadows hunting her. As sparks ignite between them, secrets begin to surface that could destroy everything or bring them closer than ever, like stories filled with romance, mystery, and twists. Hit like and subscribe for more dramatic love stories. The storm rose without warning, furious and unrelenting. It had begun with a shift in the wind, a strange humming whistle that twined through the pine trees above the cliffs, then descended into a brutal cascade of rain and salt water. Waves thrashed against the rocky coastline like beasts denied entry, their white froth leaping into the air, seeking something to devour. Thunder cracked overhead, splitting the sky with raw energy. The sea was alive, angry, vast, and terrible in its power. In the heart of it all stood a tall, weather-beaten lighthouse, perched like a sentinel on the jagged edge of the world. Its single beam sliced through sheets of rain in a steady, rhythmic sweep, its rotations casting brief moments of clarity in the murk. Inside, Elijah Kane moved through the lantern room with practiced ease, his hands checking dials and lantern oil levels, the ritual one he'd performed 1,000 times. He was a man carved from silence, lean and broad-shouldered, with a rugged face that bore the quiet of many storms. His beard was dark with rain, and his coat hung heavy against him, soaked and salt-stiffened. He had lived with the sea long enough to understand its language. Something about this storm was wrong. When the power flickered, then failed entirely, he barely cursed. He pulled on his oilskin hat and grabbed the spare torch, descending the spiral staircase 2 steps at a time. The generator would hold, but not for long. He needed to reset the fuse box before the lighthouse lost its signal completely. As he emerged onto the outer catwalk, the rain slapped his face with stinging force. He paused for a moment, shielding his eyes as lightning struck in the distance, briefly illuminating the waves in stark silver and black. That was when he saw her. A flash of pale skin against the dark water, a body tumbling among the rocks like driftwood, arms limp, hair tangled in seaweed. The vision was gone almost as soon as it appeared, swallowed by another crashing wave, but it was enough. Elijah didn't think. He ran. The rocks below the lighthouse were treacherous, even in calm weather. Tonight they were a death trap, slick and invisible beneath the sheets of rain and sudden crashing foam. But his boots knew the path, and his body remembered. The beam from the lighthouse flickered weakly through the gloom, enough to give him bearings, enough to guide him to the shore. He found her half buried in a tide pool, her body splayed among the stones like a shattered doll. Seaweed clung to her dress, a once elegant fabric torn and waterlogged. One shoe was missing. Her bare foot was scraped raw, her hair fanned out around her head, long and dark and sodden, twisted with sand and salt. Her face, turned slightly toward the rocks, was ghost pale, her lips tinged blue. He dropped to his knees beside her and pressed his fingers to her throat. The skin was ice cold, but there was a pulse, weak, fluttering, but there. "You're alive," he said, hoarse with disbelief. The next minutes were a blur. He lifted her as gently as he could, cradling her slight frame against his chest. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her breath barely warm against his neck. He carried her up the winding trail to the lighthouse, feeling every stone beneath his boots, every gust of wind trying to steal her away from him. She didn't stir. Inside, he set her down before the fireplace and stripped the wet dress from her body with clinical precision, wrapping her in wool blankets he kept stashed in the storage chest. Her skin was covered in tiny cuts and bruises, her collarbone stark and fragile, her ribs visible beneath the curve of her breasts. He averted his eyes. This was not about looking. This was about saving a life. He lit a fire quickly, the flames licking up into the chimney with a greedy whoosh. The heat spread slowly, battling the cold that clung to her like a second skin. He boiled water on the stove and poured it into a hot water bottle, nestling it against her side. He dried her hair with a towel, fingers working carefully through the snarls, until the strands lay softly against her cheek. Still, she didn't wake. Hours passed. Rain beat relentlessly against the windows, but the storm's fury began to ebb. The lighthouse beam returned with a steady pulse, cutting through the night like a heartbeat. Elijah remained by her side, sitting in a worn leather armchair, his eyes never straying far from the woman now breathing quietly before the fire. When she finally stirred, it was near dawn. A tremor passed through her limbs, and her eyes fluttered open, glassy with confusion. She blinked several times, her gaze sweeping the unfamiliar room, pausing on the crackling fire, then moving to him. He leaned forward slowly, careful not to startle her. "You're safe," he said quietly. "You were in the water. Do you remember?" Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. She swallowed, then tried again. I don't know." Her voice was raw and ragged, more breath than words. She touched her own throat with trembling fingers, then the side of her head, her brows furrowed. Panic began to surface in her expression. "Take it easy," he said, his tone low and steady. "You've been through hell. You're here now." She sat up slightly, wincing as her body protested the movement. Her eyes were large, green like sunlit moss, and full of unspoken questions. "Where am I?" "Elbridge Point," he replied. "The lighthouse on the cliff." "Who are you?" "Elijah Kane. I live here." She nodded faintly, then pressed a hand to her forehead. "I don't remember anything." He hesitated. "Nothing?" She shook her head slowly, then flinched at the pain. "Not even my name." The silence between them grew thick, filled with the weight of that loss. Elijah exhaled softly and turned to stoke the fire. Flames danced higher, casting golden light across her face. "Then we'll start fresh," he said. "Until you remember, I'll call you Mira." She looked up, a flicker of something passing through her eyes, gratitude, perhaps, or fear. "Mira," she whispered, testing the name. "Okay." A gull called somewhere in the distance. The storm had passed, leaving the world wet and raw and oddly still. The scent of sea brine and wood smoke clung to everything. Elijah stood and offered her a warm cup of water. Her fingers brushed his as she took it, and he felt the touch like a spark through his skin. Whatever had brought her to his shore, it wasn't finished with her yet, but for now she was breathing, and that was enough. Morning crept in on soft, silver feet, seeping through the fogged windows of the lighthouse with the hush of retreating waves. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and glistening with salt and dew. Outside, the sea stretched glassy and bruised, its rage quieted but not forgotten. Inside, the warmth of the fire had soaked into the stone walls, and the air hung heavy with the mingled scents of damp wool, wood smoke, and the faint brine of the sea. Mira lay on the worn couch, draped in blankets that smelled faintly of cedar and old soap. Her body felt foreign to her, like something borrowed. Her limbs ached, her skin tingled from hours of cold, and her mind was a hollow cavern echoing with fragments that meant nothing. She stared at the ceiling, tracing the flickering shadows that danced in rhythm with the firelight. The name he had given her still hung in the air, not quite hers, not quite a stranger's. Mira. Elijah moved through the room with the quiet confidence of a man used to solitude. His steps made no sound on the old floorboards, and he barely looked at her, though Mira sensed his awareness as a steady, watchful presence. He brewed coffee in a battered percolator and set out a plate of bread and fruit on the table without speaking. His silence wasn't unfriendly, just dense, like fog resting on the sea. She sat up slowly, her muscles protesting, the blanket slipping down her shoulder. The fire kissed her skin with warmth, and the smell of coffee made her stomach twist with hunger. She looked toward him, her voice tentative. "I dreamed about music," she said, A piano, and people laughing. I think there were lights. Elijah turned toward her, a faint crease forming between his brows. He handed her a chipped mug filled with dark, fragrant brew. His fingers brushed hers again, rough and warm. "Anything else?" he asked. She searched inside her mind, but it was like grasping at smoke. No faces, just a sound, like glasses clinking. The sea wasn't there. He nodded, but said nothing. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. A woman with no name, no past, pulled from the jaws of the ocean like some wrecked thing. "I must have been somewhere fancy," she murmured, looking down at the blanket wrapped around her body. Before this. The dress. It was expensive, Elijah said, his voice quiet. "Ruined now." She gave a faint, humorless smile. "I suppose I was, too." That brought his eyes to hers. They were a startling color, deep gray flecked with something storm-like. She felt them land on her with more force than she was prepared for. "You're not ruined," he said, and though his voice was soft, it carried weight. "You're alive." They ate in silence after that. The food tasted brighter than she expected, like the first bite after a long fast. She savored each morsel, her senses heightened, as though her body were rediscovering the world moment by moment. Later, Elijah offered her a change of clotheshes, of course. She dressed in a small back room that smelled faintly of soap and old paper. His flannel shirt hung past her thighs, and the sweatpants cinched tightly at her waist. She caught sight of herself in the mirror, startled. Her eyes were shadowed with fatigue, her mouth pale, but her face. Her face was beautiful in a way that surprised her. Delicate bone structure, full lips, a slender neck. She looked like someone who had once belonged to a different life. Back in the main room, Elijah was working with tools spread across the table. Something mechanical lay in pieces beneath his hands. Mira approached slowly, watching the precision of his movements. "What are you fixing?" she asked. "Radio," he replied. "Salt air corrodes the contacts. Needs regular cleaning." She tilted her head. "Can I help?" He looked at her, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face, but then he nodded. She pulled up a stool and reached for a screwdriver. As she worked beside him, her fingers trembling at first, something settled in her chest. The feel of tools in her hands, the tiny satisfaction of a screw aligning into place it, all felt familiar. "I think I know how to do this," she said, a strange thrill running through her. "That's weird, right?" Elijah watched her, eyes narrowed with quiet curiosity. "Maybe your hands remember what your mind can't." She gave a soft laugh. "Maybe I used to fix radios for a living." "Or yachts," he said, with the barest edge of dry humor. Her smile faltered. The word stirred something in her. A flash. Champagne. Velvet seats. A night sky above a dark deck, and then screaming. Cold. Falling. Her breath caught, and the screwdriver slipped from her fingers. She pressed a hand to her temple, heart racing. "Mira?" Elijah's voice was low but firm. She shook her head. "I saw something. Just a moment. A boat. A big one." There was shouting. He was beside her in an instant, a hand on her back. It wasn't possessive. It was grounding. "You don't have to force it," he said. "It'll come when it's ready." Her eyes filled, though she didn't quite know why. There was no certainty, only fragments and fear. That night, she couldn't sleep. The storm was gone, but its echo lingered. The wind still whispered through the shutters, and the waves, though calmer, had not ceased their slow, eternal rhythm. She stood by the window, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the black stretch of sea, hoping it would give something back. Behind her, the floor creaked. Elijah stood in the doorway, his presence quiet as always. "You can't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. Too many questions. and not enough answers. He moved to stand beside her, his arm not touching hers but close enough to share warmth. "Sometimes the sea takes things," he said after a moment, "and sometimes it gives them back. You were lucky." She turned to look at him. His profile in the dim light was stark and beautiful, a face sculpted by weather and time. "Why do you live here alone?" she asked. His mouth twitched, something unreadable passing over his expression. "It's easier," he said. "Most days." She nodded. "I think I used to be surrounded by people. Noise. I don't know if I miss it." He looked down at her then, and for a moment something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. The hush around them thickened. Mira reached up and touched her own wrist absently. A strange pattern was there, a faint mark, almost a scar, shaped like a circle with a line through it. She had noticed it earlier but hadn't thought much of it. Elijah noticed too. "That wasn't from the rocks," he said. She looked at it, then at him. "You think it means something?" "I think everything does," he said quietly. They stood in silence, watching the moon break through the clouds, painting the sea with molten light. Mira felt the pull of it, the ache of something just out of reach. She didn't know who she was, but she was here, alive. And maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to want to stay. It was just past noon when the knock came. A slow, deliberate sound against the heavy oak door, 3 measured raps that carried with them the chill of the ocean breeze, and something quieter beneath it, something unsettling. Mira was standing barefoot on the lighthouse steps, watching the tide drag itself in and out of the rocky shore like a restless creature. Her hair lifted in the wind, long and tangled still, though she had tried to comb it with her fingers. She had found the rhythmic crash of the surf soothing these past days, something familiar in its constancy, something to lean into when her mind grew too loud. The sound of knuckles meeting wood turned her head. Elijah had just come back from the village with supplies, his coat still wet with mist and his hands full of canvas bags. He had looked relaxed for once, a softness in the edges of his expression as he stepped inside and set the bags on the counter, but the knock straightened his shoulders. She followed him inside. The door opened with a sigh, revealing a man she didn't recognize but felt she ought to. He was older, thin in the face, with eyes like smoked glass and a fisherman's tan, his cap pressed tight to his brow. In one hand he held a newspaper, folded and damp around the edges. He nodded toward Elijah with a kind of stiff respect, then turned his gaze to Mira. His mouth opened, but whatever he meant to say fell away. Elijah stepped between them slightly, not unkindly. "Something I can help you with, Tom." The man's voice was rough as gravel. "Stopped by to see if you got your oil delivery. Didn't see the truck." Then his eyes flicked to Mira again, and I saw her picture. She felt the air shift around her. Elijah's posture became alert in that subtle, quiet way of his. He didn't speak. Tom extended the newspaper with 2 fingers. "Page 4, he said. "Thought you ought to know." Elijah took it without a word and closed the door with a calm finality. The moments stretched between them like a held breath. Mira's heart began to tap faster. Elijah unfolded the paper and scanned it quickly. Then he folded it again and set it on the table, face down. "What did he mean?" she asked. He met her eyes, his own unreadable. "You should sit down," he said. She didn't move. "Elijah, what is it?" He hesitated, then turned the paper over. A photograph stared up at her. It was her face. A little more polished, makeup pressed into every pore, lips painted a soft coral, hair swept into sleek curls. She wore a champagne-colored dress and held a clutch in one gloved hand. The caption beneath the photo read, "Heiress Arabelle Thorne still missing family offers reward." The name hit her like a strike of lightning, sudden and electrifying. Her breath left her in a soft gasp. "Arabelle," she whispered. The name curled on her tongue like a secret she hadn't meant to speak aloud. Elijah watched her with eyes like a gathering storm. "You think that's me?" He didn't answer right away. "I think it could be. The timing matches, the location, your face." Her hands moved instinctively to her throat. There was a thin gold chain around her neck, one neither of them had noticed until now, pressed flat to her skin beneath the collar of Elijah's shirt. Her fingers found the pendant and drew it out. A small, diamond-encrusted letter dangled from the chain. An A. She sat down hard in the chair, the floor tilting slightly under her. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She clutched the pendant between her fingers, staring at the photo again. "Arabelle Thorne," she said, trying to pull the name into her mouth, to own it. But it felt strange, stiff, like she was wearing someone else's shoes. "I don't feel like her." "You don't have to," Elijah said, his voice steady. "Not yet." "But what if that's who I am?" Her voice cracked. "An heiress. A missing person. A face in a newspaper. I thought I might have been someone simple, someone who fixed radios or worked on boats, someone real." He crouched beside her, hands resting lightly on his knees. "That girl in the paper might have everything," he said gently. "But she didn't have you, not like this. Whoever you were before, it doesn't change what's happened since you came out of the sea." Tears burned behind her eyes, not from fear exactly, but from a sense of overwhelming displacement. The world had shifted again. She had only just found her footing on this strange new shore, and now it was tilting under her again, trying to drag her back into a life she couldn't remember, a name she didn't know how to wear. "I don't remember any of it," she whispered. "Not the money, not the people, not even the name. Then don't rush to reclaim it." He stood and walked to the fire, tossing another log onto the embers. It crackled and popped, the scent of smoke blooming warm and rich in the room. Mira stared at the pendant, still resting in her palm. The diamonds glittered coldly in the light, brilliant but impersonal. That night, she couldn't sleep. The sea no longer offered comfort. Its rhythm felt too vast, too unknowable. She sat in the chair by the fire, wrapped in a wool blanket, staring at the photograph until the print blurred before her eyes. In her dreams, she was surrounded by gold and mirrors, voices swirling around her like perfume. There was laughter, too high-pitched to be kind, and flashes of bright light that hurt her eyes. Someone called her Belle. Someone else whispered, "She doesn't know, does she?" And then water, so much water, roaring and endless, swallowing everything. She woke with her heart pounding, her skin damp with sweat. The lighthouse was quiet, but she could feel Elijah nearby. His presence was something she had learned to trust. When she stepped into the kitchen, she found him already awake, working with his hands again, the soft whir of a gear clicking into place beneath his fingers. He looked up, saw her face, and pushed the tools aside. Without a word, he opened a cupboard and poured her coffee. She took it and sat across from him, her fingers wrapped around the warm mug like a lifeline. "I don't want to be Arabelle," she said softly. "Not yet." His eyes met hers, calm and clear. "Then don't be." And for the first time since seeing that photograph, she let herself believe that maybe she didn't have to be, not right away. Maybe it was enough to be here, in this moment, with a man who had pulled her from the sea and didn't care what her name had once been. The fog rolled in thick and low the next morning, crawling across the sea like a living thing. It wound itself between the rocks, softening the jagged edges of the cliffs and blurring the world to muted grays and silvers. The air was wet against Mira's skin, clinging to her cheeks and lashes, dampening the long strands of hair she had twisted into a loose braid. She walked slowly along the edge of the path, boots crunching softly over gravel and moss. The scent of salt and damp stone filled her lungs with every breath. The lighthouse loomed behind her, a tall shadow crowned by its quiet beacon. Elijah had gone into town to pick up parts for the radio. He'd offered to take her with him, his tone unreadable, but she had declined, needing a little more time before facing faces that might recognize her. The village felt like a far-off thing, a different country she was not yet ready to re-enter. Here, on the cliffs, she could still pretend she was just a woman called Mira, a guest of the wind and sea, not someone whose name came with a headline. She closed her eyes and tilted her face toward the soft wind. Somewhere out there, across that endless stretch of water, was the past. She imagined it as a glittering city swallowed by fog, unreachable no matter how hard she tried to row toward it. There were moments when she wanted to remember, to reach out and shake loose every buried name, every half-formed face that haunted the edges of her dreams. But there were other moments, quieter ones, when she feared what those memories might reveal. The sound of approaching footsteps broke through the hush, not Elijah's. She turned, startled, heart quickening. A figure moved through the mist, tall, upright, a coat flapping gently around long legs. He stepped into view as the fog thinned, and Mira froze. She didn't recognize him in the conscious part of her mind, but her body reacted before her thoughts could catch up. Her breath left her in a rush. Her stomach dipped sharply, and her skin tightened along her arms. He was handsome, in a deliberate, practiced way. His dark hair was swept back with a kind of careless precision, and his jaw was clean-shaven, sharp. His coat was expensive, the fabric too tailored to belong to this rugged coast. He looked out of place, like someone who had stepped from a ballroom into a painting of the sea. He smiled when he saw her, though the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. "There you are," he said. His voice was smooth, familiar. It curled in her ears like smoke. "I've been looking for you." She stepped back, uncertain, the cold seeping deeper into her chest. "Do I know you?" she asked, her voice a whisper. His smile faltered for a moment, then returned, brighter. "You do. You just don't remember. That's all right, Arabelle." She flinched at the name. "I'm Vincent." The name dropped like a stone into a still lake, sending ripples through her that she couldn't explain. Something inside her recoiled. A flicker of memory pierced the fogey's hand on her back, fingers too tight, the metallic sound of laughter that didn't belong to her. "I don't remember you," she said again, this time more firmly. He stepped closer, too close. She caught the scent of his cologne, clean, the kind that clung to fine suits and silk scarves. Her mouth went dry. "But I remember you," he said, eyes searching hers. "I've been looking for you since the night you disappeared. You left without a word, without a trace. You nearly died." Mira felt her legs tighten, ready to bolt, but she held herself still. "I don't know what happened," she said. "I still don't." "I do." His voice softened, became coaxing. "You were upset. We argued. I was angry. You were crying. And then you were gone. I thought maybe you just needed space. But when you didn't come back, I thought I'd lost you for good." She stepped back again. "How did you find me?" He glanced toward the lighthouse. "Word travels. Someone recognized your photo. I came the moment I heard." A rock shifted behind them, a scrape of boot against stone. Elijah's voice cut through the thickening silence. "She didn't ask to be found." Vincent turned, his expression cool. "You must be the lighthouse keeper." "Elijah, is it?" Elijah didn't respond. His eyes were on Mira, steady and clear. She felt the tension in his body from where she stood, felt it vibrate in the air between them. "She's not ready," Elijah said. "You need to go." Vincent looked at him for a long moment, then returned his gaze to Mira. "I know this is confusing, but you and I, we had a life together, a future. You loved me, Arabelle." Her breath caught. That word love-slammed into her like a wave. She shook her head. "You don't get to say that. I don't even know who I am yet." He stepped forward again, and Elijah moved with him, close enough now that their shoulders nearly touched. The air between them crackled with something raw. "I'm not here to hurt her," Vincent said. "I just want to bring her home." "She is home," Elijah said. Vincent's eyes darkened. "You don't know who she is. what her life was. I know who she's been since she got here. That's enough for now. Mira's heart was hammering. She couldn't breathe. She needed space, needed air, but the fog pressed in on all sides. She stepped back, then turned and ran toward the lighthouse. The wind caught her hair and lifted it like a veil behind her. The cold stung her cheeks as she pushed the door open and slammed it shut behind her. The silence inside was a different kind of storm. She stood with her back against the door, chest heaving, her eyes burning. Her hand shook as she touched the pendant still at her neck. The A caught the firelight and glittered like ice. Upstairs, she heard footsteps. Elijah entered a few moments later, slower now, the tension trailing behind him like smoke. He looked at her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "I don't want to go back," she said, her voice small and cracked. "You don't have to," he said. "I don't remember him, but my body does." She touched her chest. "It remembers fear." Elijah moved closer, his expression softening. He raised a hand and hesitated, then brushed her hair gently from her face. The touch was so light it barely stirred her skin, but it grounded her. "I won't let anyone take you away," he said. She looked up into his eyes and saw not just the promise, but the weight behind it, and in that moment something shifted between them, something fragile and unspoken, but real. She leaned into him, and he let her. The days after Vincent's visit blurred together, each one heavy with tension that clung to Mira's skin like mist. The air seemed denser now, thicker in her lungs, as though every breath had to fight its way free. She couldn't walk the cliffs without watching for a dark figure in the fog. She couldn't stand at the window without expecting to see him appear from the trees below. Elijah had boarded up the back door and changed the locks without telling her, and though she said nothing, she noticed. She noticed the way he scanned the horizon more often, how his hand lingered a beat too long on the lantern as he adjusted its rotation. She saw how his jaw tightened when the village was mentioned, and how he kept the radio off more often than not. She understood the silence between them wasn't distance. It was vigilance. Inside the lighthouse, time moved slowly, measured not by clocks but by the sound of footsteps on stairs, the way the light shifted across the wooden floor, and the low crackle of the fire when twilight crept in. Elijah kept to his usual rhythm repairs, maintenance, cooking in silence, but he hovered closer now, always within reach. Mira didn't tell him she had started sleeping with a chair pushed against the door of the small room where she now stayed. He didn't tell her he'd sharpened the hatchet again and set it near the hearth. It was in this tight space between safety and fear that the memories began to return. Not all at once, never in order. They came as sensations first. The press of silk against bare skin, the taste of white wine just before a kiss, the blinding flash of cameras, too many voices calling her name. The sound of her heels clicking on marble, the echo of it through some vast house she couldn't quite see. At night, the fragments grew sharper. She would wake gasping, soaked in sweat, heart slamming against her ribs. Elijah never came to her door, but she knew he listened. She heard his footsteps pause outside her room more than once, a long silence hovering there, and then retreat. She was grateful for that space, but it made her ache too. One morning, she found herself in the mirror again, not just standing in front of it, but truly looking. Her hair had dried in dark, wild waves. Her skin had healed, the bruises faded, the cuts turned to pale lines like whispers of what had happened. Her eyes had a clarity to them now that had not been there before. They looked like someone who had surfaced from deep water and remembered what breath felt like. She pulled open the dresser drawer where Elijah had placed her belongings, what few she had, folded flannel, a pair of wool socks, the pendant, and the dress. Torn and stained, but still beautiful in a way that was painful to see, she held it in her arms and closed her eyes. The memories came in a rush. A gala, chandeliers shaped like teardrops hanging from the ceiling. Her father's voice, brittle and cold, Vincent's hand at the small of her back, possessive even when smiling. Her laughter, strained and too bright. Then the yacht. The sea smelled different that night, sharp and briny, laced with gasoline. The party had ended hours ago, but the lights still glowed across the deck. Vincent had been drinking, but his words were clear, cold, cutting. She remembered standing at the railing, her hands clenched, the night air turning her skin to ice. "You're not leaving me, Belle," he had said. She had turned to him, heart thudding. "I already have." He grabbed her wrist, hard enough to bruise, and then water, all around her, the plunge so sudden it knocked the scream from her lungs. She didn't remember how she hit the water, only the cold, the endless cold. Mira dropped the dress and sank to the floor, her arms around her knees, the memory pressing against her like a wave. She stayed there until her breath slowed, until the shaking ebbed. Later, she found Elijah outside, working on the generator with his sleeves rolled up and grease on his hands. The morning sun burned through a thin veil of clouds, painting everything in soft light. She stood beside him quietly. He didn't look up at first. Then, sensing her, he paused and wiped his hands on a rag. "I remember," she said. He turned toward her, his expression still, waiting. "I was on a yacht. There was a fight. Vincent, he grabbed me. I think he pushed me." Elijah's jaw tensed. He took a slow breath, setting the wrench aside. "Did you tell anyone?" "No, not yet. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it." She stepped closer. "But I know I can't go back to that life. Not ever." He nodded, but said nothing. "I thought I was drowning when I fell into the water," she said, voice quieter now. "But I think I was already drowning before. I just didn't know it." She looked up at him, her voice trembling but sure. "I don't want to be that woman again." Elijah's gaze met hers, and for a long moment neither of them moved. The wind stirred her hair, lifted the corner of his shirt. "You're not her," he said. "Not anymore." She reached for his hand. It was rough and warm, and he held hers with a care that unraveled something in her chest. He didn't pull her in. He didn't move at all. He just stood there, letting her come to him, letting her choose. She stepped closer until her forehead rested against his chest. He exhaled, long and slow, and his arms folded around her, steady and sure. The thrum of his heart echoed against her cheek. "I feel safe here," she whispered. "With you." He said nothing, but his fingers threaded gently through her hair. And that was enough. The storm had long since passed, but the air that night was thick, with the kind of stillness that seemed to hold its breath. The sky stretched overhead in deep velvet hues, scattered with stars just bright enough to cast the faintest shimmer on the surface of the water. The tide was high, licking at the rocks below with a slow, hungry rhythm, and the wind had quieted to a breeze that smelled of pine and salt. Inside the lighthouse, warmth flickered from the fire, painting the walls with amber light that pulsed gently across the floorboards. Mira stood barefoot at the window, one hand resting on the cold glass, the other clutching a cup of lukewarm tea she had long since forgotten to sip. Her reflection floated in the pane like a ghost, soft and half-real, framed by shadows and the golden spill of firelight. Behind her, she could hear the faint rustle of Elijah's movements as he stoked the flames and adjusted the iron grate. The scent of burning wood wrapped around her, comforting and familiar, a kind of armor against the lingering chill of memory. She had told him everything, every fragment she had gathered, every moment that surfaced from the deep well of her lost past. The yacht, the argument, the fear, the fall. He had listened without interrupting, his silence not distant but anchoring, as if he were holding space for her pain with both hands. He had not offered platitudes or promises, only the solid, steady presence of a man who had watched storms come and go and knew better than to try and stop them. Now she turned from the window and watched him move about the room, sleeves pushed up, the fire catching in the curve of his forearms. He looked up and caught her gaze, and for a long moment they said nothing. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough, barely more than breath. "You're not alone, Mira." She stepped closer, each footfall soft against the worn wood. "I know." He stood still as she came to him, as though afraid to move too soon. The heat from the fire warmed the air between them, and the room seemed to narrow, pulling the edges of the world in close. She stopped when she was near enough to feel the rise and fall of his breath. Her eyes searched his face, finding the lines etched from weather and years, the softness around his mouth, the shadow in his eyes that matched her own. "I'm not afraid of the past," she said, her voice steady now. "I'm afraid of what it might take from me." Elijah reached up slowly, his knuckles brushing her cheek, his fingers lingering in her hair. "It can't take who you've become." His words settled into her like warmth after cold, and something inside her cracked open. She rose onto her toes, hesitating only for a breath, then closed the space between them. Her lips met his with the softest pressure, a question rather than a demand. He answered without hesitation. His arms wrapped around her, firm and sure, and his mouth pressed into hers with a heat that unfurled through her like flame. His kiss was not frantic but deep, patient, full of unspoken things that had built over days and silences. It felt like discovery, like recognition. She melted into him, her body fitting against his as though it had always known this shape, this rhythm. His hands slid up her back, beneath the hem of the oversized flannel she still wore, palms warm against her skin. She shivered, not from cold, but from the sudden, aching nearness of him. They parted for breath, foreheads pressed together, and for a long moment they just stood there. The fire cracked behind them, and the sea whispered below, but the world seemed to hold still. "I don't know what happens next," she whispered. Elijah smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Then we find out together." She kissed him again, slower this time, savoring the feel of his lips, the quiet hum of his breath, the way he held her as though he never wanted to let go. Later, they lay together on the old couch, pulled close to the fire. Mira rested against his chest, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on his forearm, her body tangled with his beneath a shared blanket. The softness of his heartbeat against her cheek grounded her, tethered her to the present, in a way no memory ever could. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows gently in their frames. But the storm felt far away now, a distant thing. Elijah shifted slightly, brushing her hair back from her face. "You feel different now," he said, not quite a question. She nodded. "I think I'm finally starting to feel real." He kissed her forehead, his lips lingering there. "You are." They lay in silence for a while, watching the shadows play across the ceiling. Mira let her mind drift, no longer afraid of what it might find. The memories still stirred at the edges, but they no longer felt like chains. They were pieces of a story she had survived, not a map she needed to follow again. At some point, she must have dozed. She woke to the soft click of Elijah rising, tucking the blanket back around her and moving quietly to the window. He stood there for a long time, motionless, the light from the fire casting his shadow tall and quiet against the wall. Something in his stillness made her sit up. "What is it?" He turned, his face unreadable. "The lighthouse signal. It cut out." She frowned, rising to join him. Could it be the generator again? Maybe. But she could see it in his eyes. The worry was deeper than a mechanical failure. They moved quickly, pulling on boots and jackets, Mira grabbing the flashlight while Elijah checked the breakers. The radio still worked. The interior lights remained on. But outside, the lantern at the top of the tower was dark. They climbed the spiral stairs together, the cold seeping in from every crevice, their footsteps echoing in the tight space. At the top, the hatch creaked open, revealing the dark glass dome where the rotating light should have been casting its beam over the ocean. Elijah moved to the mechanism, his fingers swift and confident, but the wires were intact. The bulb, replaced just last week, was unbroken. Then Mira saw it, a fine, deliberate slice in the cable near the base. "Elijah," she said, pointing. He crouched, running his fingers along the cut, jaw tightening. "That wasn't an accident," he said quietly. A chill slid down her spine that had nothing to do with the wind. "Do you think it was him?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The beam of the lighthouse, meant to protect, had been silenced. And somewhere in the dark below, the sea waited. The next morning, the sea gave back what it had taken. It came on the back of a call, carried up from the village by a wiry teenager on a rusted bicycle. The boy arrived, wind-chapped and breathless, at the base of the lighthouse, just as the sun broke through the overcast sky. Elijah met him at the bottom of the winding path, his figure tall and tense in the morning light, Mira watching from the kitchen window with her heart caught high in her throat. She could not hear the words exchanged, but she saw the flicker of recognition in Elijah's eyes, as the boy unfolded a message scrawled in pencil on damp paper. A boat had gone down in the cove just before dawn. Small, private, meant for speed and silence rather than safety. One man aboard. He had survived, but just barely. Vincent. Mira felt the cold even before Elijah stepped through the door. It was in the set of his shoulders, the storm still sitting quietly behind his eyes. He hung his coat with careful hands and looked at her as though he might break something fragile just by speaking. "He's in the clinic down in the village," he said. "They pulled him from the rocks." She sat slowly, her fingers pressed to her lips. The night before spiraled in her mind. The cut wire, the extinguished light. She looked up at him. "You think he did it?" "I know he did." Elijah's voice was calm, but tight with restrained fury. "The cable wasn't frayed or chewed. It was sliced, clean. Someone had to climb the tower while we were sleeping." "But why come back?" she asked, her voice small. "Why risk being seen?" He shook his head slowly. "Maybe he thought he could scare you, remind you that he could reach you, even here. Or maybe—" He trailed off. "What?" "Maybe he meant to wreck the boat." Elijah's voice dropped. "Maybe he knew someone would come for him if the lighthouse went dark." The weight of those words settled over her like salt spray, bitter and clinging. She had never known a person capable of that kind of calculation, but then again, there was so much about her old life she had never truly seen. Elijah turned to the window, his hand braced against the frame. The sunlight danced on the waves below, indifferent to the quiet war beginning along the shore. "He's asking to see you," Elijah said without turning. Mira's breath caught. "He knows you're here," Elijah added. "He's always known." She stood, the floor solid beneath her feet, though the world had begun to tilt again. For a moment, the girl she had been whispered inside her, timid and uncertain. But Mira silenced her with a breath. "I'll go," she said. "I want to hear what he says when he thinks I owe him something." The village felt smaller than she remembered. The narrow streets were still damp from early rain, the buildings huddled close together like old friends. The scent of salt and fish hung in the air, a reminder that this place had its own rhythm, its own memory. People looked up as she passed, some staring openly, others offering tentative smiles. She no longer cared if they recognized her. She walked beside Elijah, her shoulders squared, her hands loose at her sides. Every step forward was a step away from the woman Vincent once tried to own. The clinic was quiet, the scent of antiseptic masking, the faint metallic tang of blood. The nurse, at the desk, gestured toward the back room without a word, her gaze flicking between the two of them with veiled curiosity. Vincent lay propped up on a narrow bed, bandages wrapping his forehead and one arm. His skin looked pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, and his smile was thinner than the one he wore the last time she saw him. When he looked at her, his eyes lit with something twisted between relief and triumph. "Belle," he said, voice hoarse and rasped. "I knew you'd come." She didn't answer. She moved to the far side of the room and stood where the light fell fully on her face. He would see her clearly. No masks, no softness. "You sabotaged the lighthouse," she said. Not a question. He didn't deny it. His smile was a poor imitation of charm. "I needed a reason to see you again. You wouldn't answer me, wouldn't let me in." I panicked. "You could have died." His shrug was stiff with pain. "It was a risk." Elijah stepped closer to the bed. "You endangered lives, including hers." Vincent glanced at him like a man swatting a fly. "This doesn't concern you." Mira moved between them. "It does," she said. "Elijah saved me, not just from the ocean, from you." Vincent's eyes darkened. "You think this is about love? About some romantic lighthouse fairy tale? You don't understand, Belle. You belong to a world that doesn't disappear just because you run from it." "I didn't run," she said. "I fell. You pushed me." Silence bloomed in the room. He didn't deny it. "I was trying to stop you," he said finally. "You were being reckless." "I was leaving," she said. "You couldn't control that, so you tried to take everything with you." He shifted, grimacing. "You think you're better off now? Hiding here, playing house with some broken man who tends a broken tower?" Elijah's hand twitched at his side, but he said nothing. "I'm not hiding," she said. "And he's not broken. He's whole in ways you can't begin to understand." Vincent leaned back, his face hardening. "What now, Belle? You think you can erase everything that came before? Just live out some rustic fantasy?" She stepped closer to the bed, her voice clear and strong. "My name is Mira now. And yes, I can choose who I want to be. That's the difference between you and me. You think love is possession. I've learned it's freedom." His silence gave her all the answer she needed. She turned to Elijah. "Let's go." As they stepped out into the sunlight, the door closing behind them, Mira felt something leave her body. It was not forgiveness, not exactly, but it was release. The sea greeted them again, wind kissing her skin, the lighthouse watching from above like a silent witness. And for the first time since she had washed ashore, Mira felt like no part of her belonged to the tide anymore. She had survived the fall. Now she was learning how to rise. The sky was the color of bruised violets. When Mira stood again at the edge of the cliffs, the sea spread before her like a secret kept too long. Evening had crept in quietly, brushing everything in a softness that almost felt merciful. The wind tasted of brine and wildness, and carried with it the scent of wet earth and the promise of rain that hadn't yet arrived. Her hands were tucked into the sleeves of Elijah's old sweater, the knit heavy with the faint scent of cedar and ash. She had walked here alone, needing space, not from him, but from the thick knot of questions that twisted tighter with every hour. The village had begun to whisper again. She had seen it in the eyes of the baker when she picked up bread, heard it in the hush of conversations that stopped as she passed. The weight of her old life pressed closer now, not as a memory, but as a decision waiting at her door. People in the world beyond this coast wanted answers. They wanted names. They wanted the polished, perfect shape of the girl in the newspaper photo, the one who had vanished and come back a woman with shadows behind her eyes and a quiet kind of steel in her spine. She had the choice now. The past was no longer a mystery to unravel. It had arrived in full, and she could step back into it if she wished. The Thorne estate had sent word. The family had confirmed her identity, eager to reclaim her as though she were something misplaced and now found. They offered therapy and security and silence. They would erase what needed to be erased. They would shelter her in glass. She could go. Elijah had said nothing when the letter came. He had handed it to her unopened, his eyes careful, distant in the way that only deep care can sometimes look. He did not offer to influence her. He did not ask her to stay. He simply said, in a voice that held no edges, "Whatever you choose, Mira, choose it for yourself." But the storm inside her refused to quiet. She sank to her knees in the damp grass, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sea met the sky in a slow, dissolving blur. Her fingers dug into the earth, cool and firm beneath her touch. Here, she was not Arabelle Thorne. She was not an heiress. She was not a woman defined by how she had fallen or who had tried to catch her. She was only herself. And yet, the voices tugged at her. The one that asked if she was being a coward. The one that whispered about responsibility. The one that reminded her how easy it would be to go back, to retreat into the life she had been born into, to let others make the choices, to wrap herself in wealth and comfort and silence. But louder than all of them was the voice that remembered how she had stood barefoot beside Elijah in the lighthouse, hands stained with oil and salt, learning how to fix what was broken. She didn't want to go back to being someone whose life was curated by others. She didn't want the stage or the spotlight or the illusion of safety built on control. She wanted the real, imperfect now. She wanted the salt air in her lungs and the weight of a man's gaze who saw her not for what she had, but for what she had survived. Her breath caught, and her eyes stung as she looked out at the sea. It had given her a second chance, and she would not waste it. She rose, legs unsteady from kneeling, and turned back toward the lighthouse. The walk was slow, deliberate, her steps light on the moss-softened stones of the path. The light in the lantern room had returned to its rhythm, a heartbeat sweeping out across the water in perfect, dependable intervals. Elijah was outside when she arrived, crouched near the foundation, repairing the wiring Vincent had destroyed. His shirt clung to him in the evening damp, and his hands were smudged with soil and grease. He didn't hear her at first. She paused, watching the way he worked, calm and focused, the kind of presence that had steadied her every day since she woke gasping on the rocks. She stepped forward. He looked up. Their eyes met, and for a long moment she said nothing, only watched the shift in his face, the way something tightened and then softened, as if he were preparing for an answer he didn't want to hear but would accept all the same. She crouched beside him, her fingers brushing his. "I'm staying," she said. He blinked once, and for a heartbeat, the world went completely still. Then his breath left him, and the tension in his shoulders melted like frost in morning light. "I thought maybe," he said softly, "you might choose them." "I almost did," she admitted. "But then I remembered who pulled me out of the water, and who taught me how to stand on solid ground again." His hand found hers, rough and warm, and she leaned into the comfort of that simple touch. "I want to rebuild something," she said. "Not just for me, for others, for people who've been lost and think they don't deserve to be found. I want this lighthouse to mean something again, not just a place for watching, a place for guiding." He looked at her, and she saw the emotion rising in him, the way his eyes turned storm, dark and bright all at once. His hand lifted to her cheek, and his thumb traced the line of her jaw. "Then let's do that," he said. "Together." She nodded. There was no hesitation now. Later, they sat side by side on the rocks, watching the tide roll in beneath a sky that was now a tapestry of stars. Mira leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, their bodies quiet in the kind of peace that comes only after chaos. She thought of her former name, of the woman who had smiled for cameras and sipped champagne and wore polished armor to protect her heart. She honored her, but she no longer needed her. That life had washed away with the tide. Here, in this place shaped by wind and salt and light, she had become something stronger. Not a girl rescued, but a woman who had rescued herself. And beside her sat the man who had not demanded her past, who had not asked for proof or promises, but had simply seen her and stayed. The waves curled softly against the shore. The lighthouse pulsed behind them, steady and true. And in the dark, she smiled. The morning came gently, unfurling over the horizon in shades of pale coral and soft gold. The air carried the faint hush of the sea, a lullaby left behind by the tide's slow retreat, and the gulls wheeled above the cliffs with their cries softened by the dawn. Inside the lighthouse, the world was quiet, save for the faint clink of a spoon against a mug, the low hum of a kettle, and the soft tread of barefoot steps over aged floorboards. Mira stood at the window, the curtain brushing her wrist as she watched the sky blossom into light. The edge of the ocean glimmered with promise. She pressed her palm to the cool glass and felt the lighthouse behind her, strong and steady, a sentinel made of stone and purpose. The memory of waking in this place still lived inside her skin, the rush of salt water in her lungs, the warmth of a fire she had not kindled, the presence of a stranger who had not asked her to remember before she was ready. Now, the house held something new, not only warmth, but motion. Boxes lined the edge of the sitting room, their contents full of practical things: books, lanterns, folded blankets, extra coats and boots, a tool set, medical supplies. She and Elijah had stayed up late the night before, cataloging what they had and what they would need. Plans had poured from them like a dam cracked open. They were going to rebuild the outbuilding near the cliff's edge, the one that had collapsed under years of neglect and storms. They would turn it into a small shelter, a haven for anyone in need of refuge. Not a halfway house, not a clinic, just a safe place for people like she had once been adrift, searching, uncertain. Elijah had said little, but he had worked beside her with a quiet intensity, his hands methodical and sure. When he looked at her, there was something reverent in his eyes, as if she were not just a woman with a past, but a miracle the sea had decided to return. That morning, he entered the room with his boots laced and sleeves rolled to his forearms, a smear of oil darkening the edge of his wrist. He looked at her the way he always did, now not with hesitation but with recognition. She turned from the window as he approached, and he stopped in front of her, drawing in a breath as if to steady himself. "You still sure about this?" he asked softly. Mira stepped closer, slipping her fingers into his. "I've never been more sure of anything." He studied her, the way he often did, as though every moment she stood before him was something to be memorized. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Then we begin." They spent the days side by side in the salt-stung wind, clearing brush and hauling weathered planks from the foundation of the ruined structure. Mira's muscles burned with effort, her skin damp with sweat and sea spray, but the ache was welcome. It was the kind of tiredness earned by doing something that mattered. She wiped her forehead with her sleeve and turned to Elijah as he braced a beam against the old stonework. His shirt clung to his back, and the sun lit the edges of his hair with a copper glow. She stepped beside him and held the beam steady as he secured it, their shoulders brushing. When he finished, she looked up into his face and saw the soft curve of his mouth, the warmth in his eyes. Something in her chest swelled. "Elijah," she said, and the way his name left her mouth felt like a beginning. He glanced over, a question in his gaze, but she said nothing more. She only smiled and leaned in, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was not hurried, not stolen, but offered. His mouth moved with hers slowly, deliberately, and when he pulled back, his hand slid along her jaw as if he never wanted to let go. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the two of them stood back to look at what they had begun. The shelter was only a frame, but it rose from the earth with the shape of possibility. Around them, the wind stirred the long grasses, and the sea mirrored the sky's amber fire. That evening, Mira stood before a camera for the first time in weeks. Not in a gown, not under the command of handlers or agents or journalists. Just herself, wrapped in a knit sweater, her face free of makeup, her hair braided loosely over one shoulder. Elijah stood behind the camera, his hands steady as he adjusted the focus. He gave her a nod, and she began to speak. She did not read from a statement. She did not offer apologies or explanations for her absence. She simply told the truth. "My name is Arabelle Thorne, or at least it used to be. The world knew me as an heiress, a socialite, a woman born into a life of luxury. What it didn't know was that I was drowning long before the sea ever took me. I disappeared not because I wanted to vanish, but because I was desperate to breathe. She paused, her breath curling in the cool air, her fingers curling into her sleeves. I was found on the shore by a man who didn't ask for my past or my name. He gave me shelter. He gave me silence. He gave me the space to choose who I wanted to be. She looked into the lens, her eyes luminous. I'm not returning to the life I left behind. I'm building something new, with my hands, with my heart. This lighthouse was once a beacon for ships lost at sea. Now, I hope it can be a beacon for people. For anyone who has ever felt like they don't belong to the world they were born into. You are not broken. You are not alone. Come find your shore. When the recording ended, Elijah stepped from behind the camera and reached for her hand. She let herself lean into him, resting her head against his shoulder, the peace between them quiet and deep. Days later, when the video was shared, the world reacted, as it always did, with noise, with praise and criticism and disbelief. But Mira no longer feared the noise. She let it wash past her like tide around stone. The lighthouse stood tall above them, its light sweeping over the water in wide, even arcs. Below, the ocean whispered its old lullabies against the rocks. In the warmth of the lantern room, Elijah wrapped his arms around her as they watched the horizon fade into darkness. Mira pressed her cheek to his chest and listened to the rhythm of his heart. Each beat a promise. They were no longer waiting to be found. They had chosen each other, and together they had become the light. The morning of their wedding broke with a hush, as if the world itself had decided to hold still just long enough to honor the moment. The sea was calm, its wide blue surface touched with golden light, and the sky above held only the thinnest clouds that drifted like lace across the horizon. The lighthouse stood against it all like a sentinel carved from myth, its windows glowing with the early sun. At its base, the garden Elijah had coaxed back to life bloomed with wild roses and beach grass, a small patch of beauty tucked into the rugged edge of the coast. Mira stood before a mirror framed with driftwood, brushing a hand over the simple white dress she had chosen. It was not the kind of gown her former life would have demanded. There were no diamonds, no stylists, no layers of silk flown in from Europe. The dress she wore now was sewn by the seamstress in the village, made of soft linen that moved like wind over water. Her hair was braided and wrapped with small sprigs of rosemary and wildflowers she had gathered from the cliffs. Her skin glowed from the sun and salt and laughter that had filled her days. She had never felt more like herself. Behind her, the sound of quiet conversation drifted up from the path. A few of the villagers had come, those who knew her not as Arabelle Thorne, the heiress, but as Mira, the woman who had been reborn on their shore. A fisherman who had offered her fresh mackerel without asking her name. The grocer's wife who had stitched the hem of her borrowed coat. The boy who had once left a pile of smooth stones on her windowsill, each one etched with a careful heart. She had not invited her family. That chapter was closed. With compassion, but firmly, they had wanted to bring her home, to smooth the scandal with money and press releases. But she had already found what they could not offer: peace, truth, a life built with her own hands. When she stepped out into the light, Elijah was waiting. He stood barefoot in the sand, his linen shirt open at the collar, the sleeves rolled back to reveal the strong lines of his forearms. The breeze played with the ends of his hair, and when he saw her, something shifted in his eyes that made the air catch in her lungs. He looked at her as if she were something sacred, something found. She reached him with her heart thudding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. They joined hands, fingers interlacing, and for a moment the rest of the world dropped away. No altar, no priest, just them. The sea behind them, the lighthouse at their backs, and the wind carrying their promises into the open sky. Elijah's voice was low, roughened by emotion. From the moment I found you on the shore, I knew I would never be the same. You were not a mystery I needed to solve. You were a light I wanted to follow. I vow to choose you every day, in silence and storm, in memory and in becoming." Mira's throat tightened. She had spoken in front of crowds before, had stood on stages, had smiled through rehearsed speeches, but never like this. She drew a breath, steady and full, and spoke into the wind. "When I woke in your lighthouse, I didn't know who I was, but you gave me time, you gave me space, and in that space I found not just myself, but something stronger than memory. I found the kind of love that doesn't ask, only accepts. I vow to build this life with you, brick by brick, word by word, to meet every tide beside you." There was no applause, no cameras, only the sound of the sea and the distant cry of gulls and the warmth of hands joined in quiet understanding. They kissed, not with the urgency of new love, but with the deep knowing of two people who had walked through fire and found one another whole on the other side. Afterward, the gathering turned to laughter, and soft music played on an old violin by the village doctor's wife. Someone uncorked a bottle of wine, and a child danced barefoot across the sand with petals in her fists. Mira leaned against Elijah's shoulder as they sat on a piece of driftwood, watching it all, her head tucked beneath his chin. As the sun began to lower, casting long shadows over the cliffs, Mira pulled a small notebook from the pocket of her dress. She opened it slowly, the pages soft and lined with faded ink. She read aloud, her voice quiet but strong. "I wrote this letter the night before I decided to stay, to the woman I used to be." The conversation stilled around them, the wind dipping low to listen. "To the girl who smiled on red carpets and cried behind closed doors. To the woman who forgot how to speak unless she was performing. I want you to know you survived. Not just the sea, but the silence. You were not weak to fall. You were brave enough to leave. And in falling, you landed somewhere true." She turned the page, her thumb brushing the edge. "You are not your name, not your inheritance, not the way he made you feel small. You are the voice that came back stronger. You are the hands that build. You are the heartbeat that found a rhythm in a lighthouse beside the sea." Elijah wrapped his arm around her, his touch grounding her even as her voice trembled. "I forgive you for not knowing how to leave sooner. I love you for finally letting go." She closed the notebook and leaned into the hush that followed. It was not silence, it was reverence. It was peace. That night, after the lantern in the tower made its final sweep across the dark water, they lay together in the warmth of their small room, wrapped in soft sheets and the breathless stillness of contentment. Elijah touched her cheek and murmured, "You're home now." And she was. Not because of walls or land or blood, but because of the man beside her, and the life they had chosen, and the light that would never go out.